Did Deep Silver and Dambuster Studios just show Techland how to do a proper sequel? And is Dead Island 2 now the new king of first-person zombie games? Well, in this video, I'm going to do my best to find out by comparing it with both Dying Light games, and then you can be the judge on whether Dead Island 2 really has just dethroned Dying Light. Back in 2015, Dying Light became the king of first-person zombie games, taking the crown from the real OG, Dead Island. It was no surprise really, given that Techland Games were the developers behind that game too, so you'd naturally expect their next project to improve on it in every way. But what nobody expected was for Deep Silver to announce out of the blue that Dead Island 2 finally had a launch date. And I certainly did not expect to see the Gore physics in the trailer outdoing Techland's own sequel as a result. Well, after a 12-week delay, Dead Island 2 is finally a reality, and I have to say, they've actually put many developers to shame by releasing a finished product that did not need a day one patch or any hot fixes since. I've lost count of how many new games recently have been released broken, and then they needed several hot fixes to get them working again. So it's very impressive that Dead Island 2 is a pretty solid game, apart from a few minor bugs here and there. Of course, it has been in development for a long time now, but Dying Light 2 languished in the same development hell before finally releasing in February last year. And it goes without saying how that went, so of the two sequels, Dead Island 2 has definitely had the smoothest launch. Now, I'm pretty sure that the main reason most people want to play a zombie game is because it's really fun to destroy zombies, and Dead Island 2 has not forgotten this truth. Personally, I think they've done a great job with the zombie designs and physics. They haven't tried to reinvent the wheel, they've just taken what already worked and made it all look and move better than ever, as you'd expect from a next-gen sequel. There are health bars above the enemies, which of course many people complained about when they first saw Dying Light 2. However, this game does feel more arcadey and everything was pretty helpful, so I was okay with it. And anyway, you can turn all those HUD elements off in the options menu. There are essentially only 3 common zombie types and 6 apex zombie types, but there are so many different versions of them that it brings the amount of variance to 31 zombie types, and they've all got different faces, clothing and hairstyles on top. Of course, you can still sometimes come across the odd twin zombies here and there, but it doesn't happen often and you really don't notice. The original Dying Light had 10 zombie types that also had a couple of variations on the volatiles, goons and demolishers. And despite being very well realised as a solid physical presence in the game and having quite a few clothing types, you could argue that the heads and faces of the DL1 zombies were not that varied, to be honest. Dying Light 2 brought in a couple of new zombie types with the Banshee and Revenant, and the Howlers are basically in place of the Screamers, but despite these new additions there are still only 10 variants in the game. Of course, the differences in size and appearance and the clothing all mixes things up a bit, but to me, Dead Island 2 has done the best job of the 3 games in this respect, and even the basic zombies consistently scared the crap out of me every time one burst out from behind a door. There are similarities between each of the games, like they've all got a variation of the viral or runner zombies. The Dying Light bomber was pretty creepy in its own right, but the Dead Island equivalent, the bursters, they actually talk to you in the sequel as they get closer, which is even creepier. The Screamer in Dying Light was a freaky little baby volatile, and as I mentioned, DL2 now has the Howler in place of that. But I have to say, the Screamer in Dead Island 2 is actually pretty intimidating. The sound of it taking in a large breath makes you tense up because you know it's going to be followed by that freakish scream that will bring hordes of zombies down on you. But its scream wave physically pushes you back, and it's a real struggle to get close to it to kill the bloody thing, especially the voltaic one. The toads in Dying Light became spitters in DL2, and the Dead Island 2 versions are the slobbers, which again I think are far superior, not just in appearance, but because of the fact they come in 3 different variants, and on top of that, again like the normal zombies, you find them dressed differently and wearing different headdresses depending on where they are in the story. The Butcher is unique to Dead Island though, and the first one of those you encounter in the sequel is the stuff of nightmares, especially if you hate clowns. And they're really fast and deadly, so you should really make sure you've leveled up enough before going to the pier and meeting this guy. The biggest and baddest boss in Dead Island 2 is the Mutator, and this thing looks like something straight out of Dead Space. The Dead Island 2 zombie physics are much more reminiscent of the original Dying Light in my opinion, which is fine by me because if it ain't broke then why fix it. Both Dying Light and Dead Island 2 do a far better job of making the zombies feel engaging and interactive than DL2 did, as they put much more focus on that aspect of the game, whereas DL2 is more of a 60-40 trade-off in favour of the parkour in my opinion. So let's talk about the infamous Gore system in Dead Island 2 then. Actually, talking about it is mostly all I can do unfortunately thanks to YouTube's guidelines, and I've had to make a few of the clips black and white here and there to try and get around that. The trailers of the Gore system leading up to launch certainly made it look incredible, but I have to say I was a bit disappointed to find out most of the kills shown in it are little more than quick time animations. It's not a huge letdown though, as the melee physics are still pretty satisfying, and they only get better as you unlock more skill cards. The zombie damage effects are mental, and repeatedly punching a corpse can literally turn a fully fleshed zombie into a skeleton in no time. Of course, you're not going to really be able to do that with a punch in real life, but you know, it's a great feature to have in the game, and it's also really good fun. Now the bodies don't ragdoll after death when kicked, you know, not like they did in Dying Light, but the organs do roll around inside the ribcage and the skull, etc. Again, it's great attention to detail. Way over the top, but it's fun. Movement and combat does feel a bit clunky in the beginning, but turning the aim sensitivity up improved things for me greatly. And once I had the dodge skill, I was able to perform swift manoeuvres even with the most dangerous enemies. Unfortunately though, you're forced to choose between either the dodge or block skill, as they both use the same buttons to perform. And that's a shame really, because I would have preferred to have had the option to use both. The block is pretty overpowered and is apparently able to break any attack animation, even from the big guys. But personally, I found the dodge gave you so much more speed to avoid attacks that I stuck with it for the rest of the game. The skill card system works pretty well, but the skill trees of Dying Light and Dying Light 2 do give you more options to use without the need to swap them around. Now that's not to say that the combat in Dead Island 2 is bad. In actual fact, it's the most fun I've had slaying zombies in a game since the original Dying Light, as I find combat in Dying Light 2 to be more annoying than enjoyable, if I'm honest. Everybody's favourite pastime of drop kicking zombies is back in Dead Island 2, and there's also a Fury mode that is very similar to Aiden's Rage mode in Dying Light 2, as your Dead Island 2 character also gets bitten at the start of this story. However, unlike Dying Light 2, you can actually activate this ability at will after building up the Fury meter, and although the result looks very similar to Dying Light 2, you can still use other moves like drop kicks and ground pounds during Fury mode, or whatever skill you chose to swap out. Now this turned out to be the best way to destroy screamers and butchers for me, especially when you get overwhelmed by a whole group of zombies and these guys are there as well. I mean, it's very OP, but it does come in very handy. It goes without saying that there's a fantastic array of melee weapons in Dead Island 2, and they're all very reminiscent of the original game and the ones we found in Dying Light 1. You can upgrade them all, and for a reasonable price they can be completely repaired if you have a favourite, although you will find much more powerful weapons as you progress further into the story, so you won't want to keep those early ones forever. For me though, what makes Dead Island 2 a true zombie game is that it still has guns and explosives, and they too are fully upgradable. The biggest mistake Dying Light 2 made in my opinion is dropping guns in favour of melee combat only, as I personally feel a traditional zombie game experience has always given you the option to blast them to bits with progressively more powerful artillery, and I think these elements in Dead Island 2 are more than satisfactory and make zombie slaying infinitely more enjoyable as a result. So what about the story then? Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, I'm just going to talk about how good it is. One of the most common complaints is that Dead Island 2 doesn't even take place on an island this time, but in my opinion it kind of makes sense to explore what would happen if the virus escaped from the island and actually made it onto the mainland. It also means that you can have a much greater variety of buildings and environments like shopping malls and film studios. There's so many great sets in Dead Island 2. Of course they couldn't change the name of the game if it was supposed to be in the same universe, and personally I think choosing LA as a backdrop to a zombie outbreak was a great choice, and it gave them the opportunity to design some lavish houses for the rich and famous and give us some really cool places to explore. Now when it comes to the main characters, I can only vouch for my experience playing as Ryan, who I honestly feel was so well written and voiced that if he'd have been the only protagonist, I'd have been perfectly happy with that. But you can actually play as 6 different characters, so if they've all been written and voiced as well as Ryan has, then that's a pretty amazing achievement in itself. The NPCs in the game were just as well realised and funny. And despite the story being fairly formulaic, it worked extremely well as a vehicle to carry you through the experience. There are loads of side quests too, and even the minor characters you meet in them are good, which I cannot say so much for Dying Light 2, it has to be said. And as much as I love the original Dying Light, I honestly enjoyed the Dead Island 2 story more, you know. Now I know players have complained that it doesn't have much of a conclusion, but there are 2 more chapters coming with the expansion pass, and I'm pretty sure that they'll be picking up where we left off, and they may give us a more satisfactory end to the story. When compared to both Dying Light games, I think Dying Light had the longer and more involved story than Dead Island 2, but it was very much in the same vein. The story in Dying Light 2, however, was such a mixed bag and ended up being a bit of a mess by the end, and also very few of the characters were likeable, even Aiden. Okay, so the biggest difference between Dead Island 2 and the Dying Light games is that Deep Silver chose to go with explorable levels instead of large open world maps. The original Dead Island had 5 open world maps that you could actually drive cars around, and both Dying Light games have 2 open world maps each, not including the following DLC in the original. But Dead Island 2 is divided into 10 maps that you can unlock with story progression, and it only takes a moment to travel between them, depending on your platform. And once you've unlocked fast travel, you can go anywhere around LA, so it does a pretty good job of simulating an open world, I reckon. And let's be honest, we travel between the slums and Old Town in exactly the same way in the original Dying Light, and once all of the subways are made safe in Dying Light 2, I'm pretty sure most people fast travel around Villador rather than actually parkour from one side of the map to the other. Of course, Dying Light required a larger open world map in order to focus on the parkour elements of the game, and Dying Light 2 needed an even bigger map to accommodate its faster parkour mechanics and the new hang glider. It's clear to me that Dambuster chose to lose the vehicle element and therefore the need for a big open world in order to save resources for the amazing graphics, impressive level designs and awesome zombie slaying physics, while Techland had to implement crazy levels of copy and paste in order to create a map big enough for the parkour. And yeah, that's what I would argue makes Dying Light 2 more of a parkour sim than a zombie game. So this one's going to come down to personal preference really. I'm perfectly happy with the choices they made in Dead Island 2's maps, and the use of copy and paste is limited to things like lootable items and workbenches etc, as opposed to entire building interiors like Dying Light 2. Plus the 2 new chapters coming in the expansion pass are going to give us new areas to explore, so that possibly means 2 new maps, and that is something to look forward to. So, is Dead Island 2 perfect? No. But it's the most fun I've had with a zombie game in a long time, and it's the most polished new release I've played for years. I also think it's a great sequel, as they didn't set it way into the future like Dying Light 2 did, so we still have a world that's familiar, and more importantly we got a more traditional zombie game that had guns and explosives as well as satisfying melee combat. It took me around 29 hours to complete the story, including side quests, and I've still got plenty of side quests to do, so for a modern game, I think it's really good value for money. And if you bought the edition with the expansion pass, then there's even more to look forward to. But, is it the new king of first-person zombie games now? Well, the original Dying Light is such a masterpiece, and it had unparalleled support throughout its 8-year reign, giving it so much more content like the following DLC and Hellraid etc, that it may never be knocked off the top spot in my opinion. Of course Techland have planned to give Dying Light 2 the same level of support, but with the player count so consistently low, I'm not sure it'll be a viable option from a business perspective. And they've already started looking towards their next project now. Despite that, Dying Light 2 arguably has much more to offer as an experience than Dead Island 2 does, but personally it's nowhere near as much fun for me. I doubt Dead Island 2 will receive anywhere near the level of support that Techland gave Dying Light, but they may prove me wrong, and I really hope they do, because I would love any excuse to play this game again in the years to come. So what do you think? Is Dead Island 2 your new favourite zombie game, or do you still prefer Dying Light or Dying Light 2? Let me know in the comments as always, and if you enjoyed the video then please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers!